Good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are, which side of the United States you are, or in Europe. And welcome to a very special event, which is bringing together the European Parliament from the office in Washington, together with its Vice President and our partners, the University of Southern California, the School of Cinematic Art, and the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So our event today is to celebrate the joint winner of the LUX Prize, Cold Case Hammarskjöld. The LUX Prize was developed by the European Parliament in 2007 to support high-quality European films that go to the heart of our public debate in Europe. So not surprisingly, many of these films are political films, and today we'll be discussing what I think is an extraordinary documentary, and it's nothing if not political. So I'm looking forward to a very multifaceted debate, since the film has, I think, multiple layers. And I'm very happy to hand over to our partners. So I'm going to hand over now to the University of Southern California and to Alex Ago, who will take it from here as our technical host today. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Ago, the Director of Programming and Special Projects at the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts. And I will be overseeing some of the discussion after when we open this up to the audience. And I just wanted to give a couple of quick notes about that. We have a Q&A tab, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you can put your questions there, when we open the conversation up to the audience, we'll invite individual people to come over as panelists and ask their questions live. But it will help if we have the questions coming in when we're about to open it up, so that we know who to call on. And then I will give you a bit of warning. You don't have to turn on your video if you're uncomfortable or not ready to be on camera, but at the very least, you can turn on your microphone and ask your questions in your own words. So I will hand it back to Joe to introduce our panelists and also a special video that we have for you today.
Thank you very much, Alex. Our first panelist is the Vice President of the European Parliament, Mrs. MAIREAD McGuinness, who has special responsibility for North America. She could not be with us today because a special session of the European Parliament. You all probably know that the weekend was a very eventful one in the European Union, and we had a very important deal in the European Council on the European Recovery Fund and on the financial framework for the next 7 years. But this deal needs to be approved by the European Parliament, so there was a special session today, and this has meant, unfortunately, that our Vice President could not be with us live. But she did manage to record a live message this morning, which I invite you to listen to. And there are two things which stand out for me. One is you will see that she sympathizes very much with the investigative journalist that Mads is. She herself was a journalist for many years before going into politics. And she also points out how relevant the issues are to our politics today. So if it's possible, Alex, to play the video from Mrs. McGuinness. Thank you.
Well, I'm really delighted to join you from the European Parliament here in Brussels and to make the link with you all on the other side of the Atlantic, all the way to LA via Washington, DC and North Carolina. As Vice President for Relations with North America, I'm convinced that good EU-US relations are more important than ever, and the Parliament here is invested in this transatlantic partnership. Our liaison office in Washington has since 2009 focused on enhancing relations between the European Parliament and the US Congress, reaching out and building bridges with our friends in the US. I'm really happy that the liaison office is tonight highlighting, celebrating and supporting European films. The Parliament's LUX Prize shines a light on films that go to the very heart of European public debate, and we believe in cinema as a platform for debate and a reflection on Europe and our future. And now in these COVID-19 times, we also know that the arts, cinema and theatre are hugely impacted. My colleagues in Washington, D.C. have told me what a great reception Mads Brügger's film has had in the US. Now, this comes as no surprise, as the European Parliament had chosen Mads' film as one of our 3 Lux Prize finalists in 2019. Tonight's debate underlines that film can stir the same emotions in viewers regardless of where you are in the world, in Copenhagen, in Brussels, in Washington, D.C., LA or Raleigh in North Carolina. Cold Case Hammarskjöld tells a story of a time long past, but the events it highlights are still sensitive 60 years later. It raises questions of justice, transparency and accountability. And these issues are important today because injustice, lack of transparency and lack of accountability damages us all and our democracies. Hidden powers tampering with our elections, the work of the far right and other extremist groups. It's the same anger we felt in front of racial injustice and the cry that Black Lives Matter coming from the US and resonating around the world. Here in the European Parliament, we will always stand for the rule of law, and this morning we had a debate about that in the Chamber. We stand for truth, justice, human rights and democracy here in Europe and around the world. Week after week, we strive to make sure that our work is embedded in these fundamental principles. And the democratic voice of EU citizens, we take all possible steps in our quest for truth and justice. And just like in the US, we as lawmakers cannot do this on our own. Our strength comes from our citizens who guide us, energise us and raise our consciousness with their work, often coming at huge personal risk and sacrifice. Mads' film reminds us how filmmaking and cinema can be a force for raising our consciousness. And these are the kinds of film that we in the European Parliament feel humbled by and would like everyone to watch. I wish you a very good discussion this evening and look forward to the day where we can watch another Lux Prize film together, this time from the comforts of a good old-fashioned cinema seat.
So I think it's over to you, Mads. I think if yes,
I should take it from here.
I think you would be. I think at this point it would be very good to hear from the director of the movie. I think you need no introduction at this stage, Mads. I think everybody's very well aware, and we've had an extraordinary number of downloads of your film. So I think you can take it that the audience has seen the film, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. I mean, it's such a multi-layered film, and there's so many films that kind of follow on. We had a small exchange recently about Conor Cruise O'Brien, and you mentioned the story you'd heard, and there's a whole other film there. So you really touched on something like a turntable that puts a spotlight on a whole convergence of very important big issues of not just of 1961 but also of today. Over to you, Mads.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to everyone who is joining the webinar and who has been watching my film. I think, just to put you up to speed about what happened since the film was released, first and foremost, the UN released last year their latest report about the death of Dag Hammarskjöld. The investigation is being spearheaded by a Tanzanian judge named Uthman, entitled Eminent Person in the UN system. And he is a very gifted and very thorough judge. And the latest report is leaning towards a conspiracy to assassinate Dag Hammarskjöld. They have uncovered more evidence, more witnesses. We also shared all our documents and the findings with the UN and made sure that investigators from the UN met with our main witness, Alexander Jones, in Stockholm, where he gave them his affidavit, which they find to be credible. They were only discussing his knowledge about Saima and the assassination of Hammarskjöld and the structure of Saima. Also, thanks also to the film and our collaboration with the British newspaper, The Observer, they went to South Africa and investigated some of the claims of Alexander Jones. For example, Alexander Jones told The Observer that his sister was also part of the South African Maritime Research Institute. They had a fallout with each other, and she relocated and moved to Australia. And The Observer had a stringer track her down in Australia. And she told the stringer that she was part of CIMA. She was in fact wearing a similar uniform for women, as is shown in the film. The ensign, who was an assistant of Maxwell, Debbie Campbell. And she went to CIMA meetings and met with Maxwell and also the predecessor of Maxwell, Flag Commodore Wagner. And they were, according to her, dressing in these weird, antique white Navy uniforms. So that is, a corroboration of one of these statements of Alexander Jones. He is still at an undisclosed location outside of Africa. I think it will be dangerous for him to go back to South Africa for a long time, because there are people there who have an axe to grind with him. Also, we continue to find leads and are being contacted by people who are in the know about the death of Hammarskjöld, but also about the skeletons which are still in the closet of the apartheid regime. Personally, recently I discovered that Maxwell and CIMA was actually looking for sunken treasure. Back in the 80s, he launched an expedition to salvage a Portuguese silver bullion vessel, which sank in the Indian Ocean. I found a person who was a witness to that expedition, which evolved into a total quagmire. Maxwell and his people were fighting amongst themselves about how to split up the treasure. But there's actually truth in it when the doctor in the film tells about how CIMA was looking for sunken treasure. They actually did do that, which is also kind of disturbing and weird, I guess. And so I can go on rambling and ranting for a long time, but I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Mads. That's a very interesting sidelight. I mean, it's interesting you're following on these trails and uncovering, lifting up the blanket that has lain on all of these issues for so many years. So our third panelist is Professor Stevens, who's John D. Stevens, who's the Lenski Professor of Political Science and Sociology in UNC in Chapel Hill. And he's also the director of the Center for European Studies, which is Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. So John, very happy to have you with us, and perhaps you could give us an insight into some of the political aspects that strike you about the film. I think we talked yesterday about decolonization and other issues, but it'd be very good to hear your perspective. And I understand also you were living in Sweden at the time of these events, so you know,
out of the events.
Interesting perspective. John.
Yeah, let me approach this from two different ways, reflecting different periods of my academic career. On the one hand, when I wrote my dissertation on Sweden, I lived in Sweden for 3 years during the 70s, first time just about 50 years ago next month. So there's that side, a little bit about Hammarskjöld, where he came from, why he was so revered within Sweden. And then the second one is after the Sweden work, and I published that, my wife and I wrote a book on the Caribbean. And so I was looking up close at decolonization in the Caribbean. So a bunch of these things that are happening in these African countries have a real mirror image in what's happening or what happened in the Caribbean in the 50s and the 60s. So we were in Jamaica, so we were mainly looking at the English-speaking Caribbean. So let me start with Hammarskjöld, and his position and the position of his family in Sweden is a very interesting one. His one of his ancestors was made a noble by the Swedish king in 1610, so the family is noble. But like a lot of the Scandinavian nobility, they aren't big landowners. They are civil servants and military officers. That's his sort of background. And his father was Prime Minister of Sweden, and he was governor of Uppsala, the region of Uppsala. He's landshövding. He was a conservative, but he wasn't really a politician. He was more of a civil servant and an academic, Hjalmar Hammarskjöld. So that's sort of the background that Dag comes up. He goes to Uppsala with a degree in a licentiate in law, then does a doctorate in economics. And then in 36 to 45, he is a state secretary in the Ministry of Finance, and then cabinet secretary in the Ministry of Finance, and then minister without portfolio, 51 to 53. Now, all of those posts, they're cabinet level posts, they're in social democratic governments, right? And so he's from a noble conservative family, but he's a minister in the social democratic governments. He's never a member of the Social Democratic Party. So he has a family and political span that kind of goes the whole spectrum in Sweden. And as I said earlier, his family earlier were civil servants and above all military officers, lots of military officers in his parentage. In the 20th century, the Hammarskjölds were a lot diplomats like him, right? So several of his brothers and nephews and stuff like that were diplomats. When he was appointed UN General Secretary in 53, he was actually a compromise candidate between the West and the USSR. A former Prime Minister of Canada was the West candidate, and then the USSR vetoed him. And then Hammarskjöld was not, well, his biographer says that in 53, he had a reputation at that time as a brilliant economist, an unobtrusive technician, and an aristo bureaucrat. So he was not expected to step on toes, right? And then, but unless he was not going to do a very good job, he could not help to step on toes, because what you have is the Cold War really raging, and this is interacting with decolonization. So by this time, the two dominant colonial powers, Britain and France, well, they weren't living in the 19th century anymore. And a lot of those colonies were not that economically advantageous to them. Who they were advantageous to was the colonial elites, the landholders. And then on the other side, both in the Caribbean and in Africa, mining interests. And so they greatly feared decolonization because the landholders feared, black masses come to power. They're going to expropriate us, and the mining interests, the same thing. So they feared decolonization, and that was really the alignment, was the local anti-colonial or independence movements against, on the other side, the local, in both the Caribbean and Africa, largely white landowning elites, and then the mining interests. And you can see that in the movie, right? That province that Hammarskjöld was flying to was this breakaway province, Katanga. And, a lot of people said, well, it's the mining interest in Katanga is behind the rebellion. And so then, because it's the Cold War, and the Soviet Union, which is under Khrushchev now, is aligning itself heavily with decolonization. And in fact, Khrushchev wanted Hammarskjöld out. And there's a session of the UN where Khrushchev leads the whole Soviet bloc hammering their shoes on their desks against Hammarskjöld, right? He wanted to replace Hammarskjöld with a triumvirate where one would be a representative of the Soviet bloc, one kind of the West, NATO, and the third, really the third world. A decade later, we would have said the non-aligned countries. And fortunately, that didn't work because, of course, everybody would have, it was going to be anybody could veto, and then the UN just wouldn't be able to do anything. But he thought, and the reason Khrushchev didn't like Hammarskjöld, he thought he was being too timid on decolonization. So that's the context. So they're pushing decolonization. So then who's on the other side? Well, who's on the other side is the Western intelligence services. And, you know, of course, they're at the core of a ton of conspiracy theories, especially the CIA, but also MI6. And so that comes across in the film, right? I can just say, we know in retrospect that a bunch of this so-called conspiracies were true, right? In other words, what the CIA was doing, above all in Latin America and the Caribbean, but all over the world, was undermining governments that they saw as too friendly to the Soviet Union. And I'll give you one example from my area of the world, and how some of the complex, largely this was pitting sort of black and brown masses against light-skinned elites. In Guyana, it was, British Guyana was very complex. It was an independence movement that initially united blacks and East Indians after the end of slavery. They imported a bunch of East Indians to work on sugar plantations and rice plantations. Anyway, this united front split along racial lines with the majority of the Indians supporting the PPP, and Chetty Jagan, its founder, who was a communist. And, you know, he was not a communist sympathizer, he was a communist. So the CIA, in 1964, the CIA intervened on the behalf of the PNC under the leadership of Forbes Burnham, who was black. So you had blacks in the CIA aligned against and on that side, of course, the mining interests, which in Guyana were bauxite industries, that is aluminum. Anyway, they basically overthrew the Chetty Jagan government through a completely rigged election, and then rigged all elections for 20 years and turned Guyana into an authoritarian regime. And it was really the CIA intervention in 1964 that led this way. And that was just really not uncommon in this period across the Caribbean and Africa. All right, I think that's enough.
Thank you very much, John. I think that's a very good segue, and absolutely it struck me very much in the film how you could say the film in a way is bookended with John F. Kennedy's public expression of sympathy for the death of the UN Secretary General, and at the end of the film, the suggestion, as you were just saying, John, that somehow the CIA were involved via sort of British intelligence, via South African proxies, and so on. So, you know, the film is bookended with the public face of the United States and the secret face. So it raises, you know, big questions about how free the intelligence agencies were to operate in these times, and, you know, how important it is to have mechanisms of democratic control. But so I think I've done my bit, Alex. So I hand back over to you to manage the Q&A session. I'm sure there'll be many questions. I have some questions of my own, but I think we're here to have a discussion with the students. So let's do that.
I wanted to just quickly kick things off by asking Mads a question related to the power structures, because Mads, your films are incredibly unique in that you are a central protagonist and you are consistently putting yourself very publicly up against power structures that could very much also make you disappear. Whether that's in Korea, in North Korea, or in the case of this film, you're pursuing stories that threaten power structures with people who are still very much alive. I'm curious to know a little bit about this project. At what point did you realize that the investigation was taking you down a path that would be very threatening to people, not simply you know, something that happened in 1961, but the remnants of an organization that may still very much have influence to the point where your production is shut down and you yourself might be threatened?
Well, first of all, I should say that we did not receive any threats while shooting this film. We were never warned off by anyone. We did encounter resistance from archives and from politicians, but that was as far as it went. As the film says, there are clearly people who are in the know about the South African Maritime Research Institute whom do not want to spill the beans. But most of these people, it's, you know, they are, you know, above, you know, middle age. I would say they are elderly men and not as dangerous as they used to be, most likely. For a long while, I was struggling with, you know, how to engage with the South African Maritime Research Institute, if it should be in the film at all. Because as you know, what most scholars and researchers within the field of, you know, Dag Hammarskjöld murder mystery law thought, and when I began working on the film, was that it was probably a piece of fiction, and Maxwell was probably the only member of the South African Maritime Research Institute. And before this film, you know, nobody have met or seen or heard from any other SIMA members who, you know, show their faces and are named. So in that sense, this film is really a game changer. And what really made me change my mind was, you know, first of all, meeting Clive van Fürsten, who has the SIMA diploma, and then finally meeting Alexander Jones, and then also meeting the brother of Dagmar Feil, which made me realize that SIMA was something very real and very dark and sinister, which also made me think that I had to reconsider, you know, Maxwell's obsession with HIV and AIDS, because it remains to be proven, you know, how advanced was this program, and how in what way were they acting out, supposedly or allegedly, you know, vaccinating Black Africans with you know, dirty vaccines. What can be said for sure is that they were, you know, discussing and planning for a genocide, which I thought, you know, or finally realized it should be in the film. But it was a you know, a long and windy road Jørgen and I traveled, and in the end, you know, every year in Copenhagen, in Denmark, I had to appear in front of the Danish Film Institute and explain about how come why it was not possible for me to finish off my film. And it became a running joke in Copenhagen, saying, you know, so Mads, how is your Dag Hammarskjöld film coming along? Implying the film that you will never be able to finish. And you know, Jørgen and I were sitting on top of this, you know, mountain of research, and there were points where I simply did not, you know, see any kind of film being, you know, possible to edit out of this, you know, Byzantine material.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the people that are actually, on camera in two specific instances. Tieni Grunewald, who it would appear is lying to your face.
Yes.
And then, of course, Alexander Jones, who is, of course, offering a wealth of information, and he could have done that perhaps privately. In fact, at one point, he even does ask you to turn off the camera. I'm curious to know what the conversations were about the fact that this would be publicly recorded. How do you approach that as a filmmaker?
These are important questions. Regarding Tieni Grunewald, he was, a regular guest in the Chamber of Secrets of the apartheid regime. And normally guys like him do not give interviews. 1 year after the interview, he passed away. So it was, in the nick of time that we got to see him and meet with him. And for me, it was a game changer in the sense that he's very firm about Maxwell being connected with British intelligence. He told us, as is in the film, that Maxwell knew people in London that you only know if you are a made guy, so to speak. Men whom Grunewald also knew, which contributed to my, to me realizing that I had to reconsider everything I knew about Maxwell at that point in time. But clearly, he is not being honest with us as the old spy master as he is. He is like a central casting agency guy who is, he's already made for a John Le Carré novel. Because for sure he knew about Simon. But does not want to discuss it with us. But he knew what we were working on, and he was, going on the record with us, and that was not a problem at all. Regarding Alexander Jones, the film makes it look much more easy than it was. Prior to shooting the master interview, the interview which is in the film, we met with Alexander Jones, I think, 6 months before, and shot a research interview with him. And at that point in time, he would only discuss Seimer and Hammarskjöld, what he knew about the killing of Hammarskjöld through being an active member of the South African Maritime Research Institute. We did, ask questions about the Maxwell's interest in AIDS and HIV and other nefarious activities of Seimer, and he was, not very forthcoming. So when we meet with him to shoot the master interview, it comes as a total surprise to Jørgen and I that he opens up in the way that he does, and actually confesses, killing people himself. Which meant that afterwards we hired a lawyer to actually take care of the interests of Alexander Jones, to offer him legal advice about also, what is in the film, because there should be a legal reckoning for him at one point, because he does confess, killing people for the South African Maritime Research Institute, which needs to be investigated clearly. But he was, of course, everything he says should be scrutinized and questioned and so on. But at the end of the day, you do have to recognize the bravery of Alexander Jones. He has nothing to gain from being in this film. There's no glory and fame for him. There's no money to be made. It is simply because, as he says in the film, he needs closure. And he thinks it's about time that the truth is told about the South African Maritime Research Institute. And he stuck to his word. And to be absolutely sure that he knew that what we were releasing, we showed the final rough cut to him, and he had no problems with that.
I want to get to the audience questions, but I also wanted to know your perspective on the investigations that have happened leading to the starting point of your investigation, because the things that you uncover are extraordinary, and with other investigations happening into obviously the assassination, why was none of this uncovered by the official investigation going into this, as opposed to an individual filmmaker? What's the difference here between government investigations into this and the pursuit of it from a documentarian?
Well, there are loads of differences, also some similarities, but first of all, you have to recognize that there are several schools within this field. There are researchers who believe that there was a blind passenger aboard the plane. There are people who believe that Hammarskjöld was suicidal and made the plane crash himself. It's just like with the Kennedy assassination. It's the literature regarding the killing of Dag Hammarskjöld would fill the bookshelves of Mr. John Stevens easily. But regarding the official investigations, right after the crash, Rhodesia did their investigation, which was a mockery. There was witness tampering. They were preventing black witnesses from giving their affidavits, and it's a huge embarrassment, basically. Then the UN did their investigation. The Rhodesian one, their conclusion was that it was due to pilot error that the plane crashed. The UN did their investigation, which was undecided. Then Sweden, many years later, did their investigation. A man named Bent Rösiö, who was a Swedish consul to the Congo, he was promised full access to all the files and papers of the Swedish government. And partly because of that, he came away concluding that it was most likely pilot error. Later on, he discovered that he was actually not given full access to all the files of the Swedish government, which made him understandably so enormously angry and made him question his own conclusion. And then finally, thanks to a British historian named Susan Williams, who published a landmark book in 2011 named Who Killed Dag Hammarskjöld, and also thanks to works of private researchers such as Jørgen Bjørndal, who is in the film. There was a critical mass in time which pointed towards this having to be, re-engaged, which the UN finally did. And then after a lot of, bureaucratic entanglements, Judge Ottman was appointed, and he is now spearheading the investigation. I think and hope eventually it will lead to something. For example, South Africa recently finally appointed a liaison officer who will help the UN with, getting to the bottom of this story.
Does the fact that you had any funding from MAIREAD play into an endorsement of the findings of the film? I'm curious the relationship between funding from the European Union and the fact that this is documentation of something that is, as you say, one component of a variety of sort of perspectives on the story.
No, when we began shooting the film, as in 2010-11, as I said in the film, the very idea that Hammarskjöld was the victim of a conspiracy to assassinate him was, considered a conspiracy theory for senior citizens. But that changed, drastically as we were shooting the film. But your image did not, they were not. I think first and foremost they were interested in this being, most likely a very thrilling political documentary, and that was their stake in the film. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to invite some people over to ask their questions live, and let's start with Janelle Portelli, and then I'll go to Sheila Sofian from our faculty. When I bring you on as a panelist, you'll be able to turn on your video and your microphone. And if you don't want to turn on your video, that's fine. Just please make sure to turn on your microphone. So Janelle, I'm going to move you over now. Oh, we had her, but maybe she wound up dropping the call. So I'll ask this question instead. So for Professor Stevens, to which degree do you think stories like these still happen today in the US and in the EU? The Parliament members spoke about the work they do for transparency and justice. Does the European Union have enough powers to investigate European intelligence and national governments?
Okay, let me look at her question again. I was reading it just a second ago.
Sure, I'll also put it in the chat.
Where did it go? Oh, Q&A, that's what it is. Yeah, I actually looked at that question and I sent my wife, who is a Latin America specialist, an email to say, to what extent is this still happening? And well, there's no question that after the end of the Cold War, a bunch of the reasons for the US to do this stuff disappeared. But no, they didn't disappear, but they're much less than they used to be. So here I would say it's not so much alignment with the Soviet Union. Okay, let me give you an example that she said, yes, they were involved in the attempted coup against Chavez. That's the first one, right? And okay, well, Chavez made himself known as very anti-American, right? So obviously the Soviet Union wasn't behind it because anti-Soviet thrust was not behind it, but in other words, the CIA was not going to forget their old ways overnight. And you have to say that that had the toleration. I don't know what year that would have been, whether that's the end of Clinton or the beginning of Bush. But anyway, it doesn't disappear, but it's not the same scale as it was because the Soviet Union isn't there as an enemy. And so countering Soviet influence is not what it's about. It's about countering anti-American movements.
Okay, I'm going to try and bring over Sheila Sofian, and then I would like to go to Jules Minton after that.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you because I thought the film was really very interesting and informative and also really creative in the way it was made. I'm really interested in knowing whether or not the issue about the HIV vaccinations, first of all, if you have any evidence that they actually succeeded in giving people HIV/AIDS, and also Has there been any follow-up, any investigation on that specific aspect of the film?
Thank you, Sheila. Well, it's an enormously complex and also very important question that you raise. The New York Times, after the world premiere of the film, published a story which, raises questions about the claims of Alexander Jones. In their article is a South African AIDS specialist who says that the likelihood of being able to do that at that point in time is very minute. Almost impossible because you would need very advanced laboratories and a lot of funding if you would be able to produce dirty vaccines contaminated with HIV on such a scale as is suggested by Alexander Jones. What is in the film is that you have two persons who had the experience of taking part in such a program, namely Dagmar Feil and Alexander Jones. They, the brother of Dagmar Feil, Carl Feil, and Alexander Jones do not know each other. The reason why Alexander Jones knows about Dagmar Feil is because the man who recruited Dagmar and brought her into CYMAR, a man named Mark, was a member of Alexander Jones's unit. That is not in the film because it would make it, much too complicated. It was a darling I had to kill. But that is why he knows about Dagmar. So you have two people who had the experience of taking part in such a program. And then you have, of course, all the writings of Commodore Maxwell, where he is describing how you could use HIV as a biological weapon of warfare to radically alter the demographics of South Africa. What most people are not aware of, and it seems to me that the New York Times was, either not, addressing it, or maybe they were not aware of it, was that during the, endgame of the apartheid regime, the regime in Pretoria was actually financing what was at that point in time one of the world's most aggressive and advanced biological and chemical warfare programs. It was called Project Coast. They had a huge laboratory at Rodenplaat outside of Pretoria, and it was really a little shop of horrors. They were doing research into all kinds of toxins and poisons, bacteria, vira, everything you could possibly produce in order to they were afraid of a black tidal wave that would, crush this increasingly fragile white regime. So they were, of course, looking for a black bomb, so to speak. What is open source and what is in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission records, where people working at Rodenplaat gave testimony. They were, for example, almost done producing a vaccine which would make black people sterile. That vaccine had been produced. They were discussing how to administer this vaccine. That is just one example out of many, and it's horrible actually. Everything what went on inside Project Coast. So if that is what we know to be true today. The idea that they would also engage with HIV does not seem as far-fetched as it may sound to us, because at that point in time HIV was making its way down through Africa, and maybe the regime would think if we can contribute to make this snowball rolling, it will work in our favor. It's an absolutely horrific and terrible idea, but if you know about the evilness and the desperation of this, dying and decaying regime, it is not impossible. But of course, if you need to get to the, if you really need to investigate and verify what Alexander Jones tells us and what Dagmar Feil was experiencing, you would need the powers of a national state, and that would of course be South Africa, which should press for an investigation into this. So far, unfortunately, they have been pretty much ignoring it, and so has South African media, unfortunately. I think it is, the darkest secrets of the apartheid regime is somehow, and understandably so, still taboo in South Africa.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'll go to Jules Minton next, and then Johnny Joseph. Okay, Jules, you're on our side.
Hi, this question is for Mads. I've noticed over the course of your 3 documentaries that I've seen that you've tended to get far more serious while still maintaining the element, which is present in each of them, of putting yourself and sometimes others into extreme physical danger. I sort of think, I admire what you're doing very much, and I admire the increasing seriousness of the topics that you seem to be taking on. Are you planning on continuing in this vein and becoming sort of a combination of Clark Kent and Superman?
Thank you, Jules. Well, it's easy to get the impression that I am a danger tourist or a extreme thrill seeker when watching my films. But actually, I'm very concerned about, safety, the safety of others, my own personal safety. If this was all about getting myself, assassinated or beaten up, there would be much more easy ways to accomplish that. I am just finishing off my next film, which is sort of, what was the title of the latest Avengers film?
Endgame.
Endgame. That is my Avengers Endgame. It brings everything in my previous films together in one film.
I'm looking forward to it. With great
Thank you, Jules.
And Jules, you also had an interesting second question, which I think you should just...
Oh, well, this one was more of a detail. One thing that struck me in the film that you noticed but never went further on was the fact that Hammarskjöld's body was relatively in good shape as compared to the others in the plane, which were horribly burnt. Has anyone done any research into why that happened?
Well, there are ideas about it. There is the UN researchers made a drawing of where the passengers were sitting in the plane, and Hammarskjöld was sitting in the very back of the plane. There are also reports about him as they were approaching Ndola being inside the cockpit at one point. But if we presume that he was sitting in the back end of the plane, that could explain. Some people would suggest why he is relatively undamaged. But it is still something which keeps me awake at night. It is very weird.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go next to Johnny Joseph and then Jay Morgan. Oh, there we go. All right, you're on with us, Johnny. Okay, maybe while Johnny's getting his audio connected, I might move over Jay in the meantime. So Jay, I'm going to bring you over as well.
Okay, there we go. Hi, thanks. So I also have a question for Mads. Just to the degree that your movies, or at least this one, deal with very serious topics, there's also often an element of humor included in it. And I was wondering how you made sort of the creative decisions on including that element when and how to do so. And also, given that this story is very convoluted, deals with a web of facts and insinuations, how you made decisions on how to tell the story and sort of going down this garden of the forking paths.
Thank you, Jay. Well, quite early on, I realized that this film would be saturated with narration, that there would have to be a narrator in the film and a lot of narration. So I was looking for some sort of device which would make this narration, more appealing, entertaining, and cinematic. Also, very early on, looking at all the most important documents relating to the case, it is somehow, a film about typewriting and typewriters, because it stems from the era of typewriting. And me being the son of two journalists who was active in the 70s and 80s, I grew up with the sound of typewriters, and I have a fetish for typewriters. And all of this led me to the idea of having the secretaries in the film. But it is also a way of reenacting colonialism, also reenacting Maxwell and Simar, and it was shot in the most, puritanical, documentarian way possible. It was not scripted at all, the scenes with the secretaries. I was simply hoping, I told them, as we go along, you are, free to ask any questions which pops up. And gradually, they began questioning, my my ideas and my, certainty about the aspects of what I was working on. And in the end of the film, they have the upper hand, which I think, makes the film much more entertaining.
Great, thank you.
Also, I have there's clearly a performative side to me. I enjoy acting out. I enjoy dressing up. And of course, wearing a pith helmet is something I clearly enjoy. They, as a prop, they work wonders in film. It was really bizarre for me because while we were editing the film, Melania Trump traveled to Kenya, and she was wearing the exact same outfit, a white pith helmet and safari pants and a white shirt, but she was doing it for real, I guess.
Okay, Johnny, we have you now, so why don't you jump in? I can see you, Johnny. Do you have audio as well? Oh, okay. I see. Okay, so I'm going to, I guess I'll you know what? Let's go out to our next person, Judith Pius. It doesn't seem like she came through either. Oh, there we go. Okay. Judith, can you hear us? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. I got screwed up, but my questions were really answered. I asked about why they were using the typewriter, and also about Dag Hammarskjöld's body not being burned like the others. So thank you, but my questions are answered.
Okay. Let's see. Let's take maybe two more. We'll bring over Jan Brandt. We just need you to unmute.
How are we doing?
Good. There we go.
So my question was about the Ace of Spades, and this was supposed to be a clandestine operation. My first question is, why would the CIA leave a calling card that was probably fairly well known, at least among the spy organizations?
Thank you for the question, Jan. Well, I am just as puzzled about it as you are. What can be said for sure is, from the pictures taken when he was lying on the tarmac at the crash site, that there is a playing card sitting in his shirt collar. Then in the film, we meet the only civilian photographer who was giving access to the crash site, and he was told that it was the Ace of Spades. But why you would leave your calling card there, I simply don't know. The US Army, as a way of waging psychological warfare, used the Ace of Spades in Vietnam, because they knew that the VC had a lot of superstition about the powers of the Ace of Spades. Besides that, it is, commonly known as the death card, and is a card which suggests, a violent death. In the film, Alexander Jones says, please turn the camera off, because he claims to know about the CIA using the Ace of Spades as their calling card in other operations undertaken in the DRC. In order to honor my promise to Alexander Jones, I cannot be detailed about that. He told me about these operations. It's very difficult for me being in Denmark to investigate and verify these claims, and I am still, in the dark about if this is true or not.
So I had just a brief follow-up question, again about the Ace of Spades. So the plane is shot down. We think the plane is shot down out of the air by this mercenary pilot.
Yes.
And that was the backup plan. The first plan was really that it was supposed to explode by a bomb planted on the plane.
Yeah.
So we rush this guy up into the air, I can't remember his name, to shoot the plane down. The plane is destroyed close to the airport. Who would have been able to get, this Ace of Spades thing is driving me crazy. Who would have been able to get to the crash site so fast to beat anyone there who would have been part of a rescue team or a search team to stick a card in there? It just seems so odd to me.
Well, you have to realize that 15 hours went by from the plane crashed until it was officially discovered. They had a time frame of 15 hours where they had plenty of opportunities to tamper with the plane and the bodies and so on. And several of that is not in the film, but several of the black witnesses, they were charcoal burners living in the area. They were being warned off by white soldiers in fatigues who told them to vacate the area, basically. and that was before the plane was officially found.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I also look forward to your next film.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to welcome Ryan Malek to ask a final question. You're on with us, Ryan.
Hi, hello. Yes, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. Actually, I would like to ask maybe both Mads and Professor Stephens, but mostly to the professor, actually, because as a political analyst, I'd like to ask what, how much do you think the general public in Europe and the United States, it doesn't matter, the voter at the end of the day, would be concerned about government secrecy in acting around the world, government's human rights records when it's away from home? Do you think this is a matter which it shocked us when watching Mads' movie, but does it matter when it comes to the grand scheme of things, especially elections?
No. In other words, when you talk about what people vote for, they don't, and except when you come to times of war and stuff like that, people vote on domestic policy. So, and most of Western Europe and in the United States, right? Somebody early in the Clinton administration, I think it was Carville, said it's the economy, stupid. Well, I mean, that's really what you vote for. And so it's only in times where you get an unpopular war like Vietnam or something like that. I mean, right now, people might be voting about COVID, but I think how many people are going to vote about really be motivated by covert activity by their governments. It's not very big.
Okay, perhaps I could just in and say a big word of thanks to all the panelists, to John and to Mads, and thanks again to Alex for co-organizing this fascinating discussion, which I really enjoyed. I've had to bite my tongue most of the time because I was wanting to come in and ask lots of questions, but the purpose of the event was to hear what the audience had to say and how people, and to hear Mads for his wisdom. And I must say we all wish Mads great success in the future, and we're looking forward very much to his new release. And I certainly hope that we'll be continuing this discussion in the future. So thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And may I just add, if anyone out there hasn't seen The Red Chapel or The Ambassador, that should be absolutely required viewing. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.
Hey guys.
Bye.
Bye.